Yesterday, so please be kind. I may show some effects of jet lag, but I feel pretty good right now. And please let me know if there is anything that I can do to make the communication more smooth. I am not able to see most of you, but I trust that if there is any problem, you will put it in the chat and Connie will monitor and we will make appropriate adjustments. So as I said, it's my great pleasure to be here with you today. And I'll be sharing some old work and some very, very new work, actually. That is the first time I'll be presenting. I want to take a minute to give you an idea about where I come from and my perspective, because I think that Connie's group and my group have complementary perspectives, perhaps, on the kinds of questions that we ask.
Nice to meet you. Would you like
answering those questions?
to be my husband?
So I just want
everyone can mute themselves, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So here I've just chosen two photos that sort of represent my beginnings and my current day. So I grew up in a family with two deaf parents and who used American Sign Language. And this photo is me with my parents at my father's 50th reunion from Gallaudet University. I was very happy to share that with him. And a more recent photo with a group of deaf people that Annie Sanghas and I have been working with in Nicaragua to help us learn about their sign language in Nicaragua. And I will say a little bit more about that at the end of today. So my training has been in cognitive science, developmental psychology, sign language linguistics, gesture studies. I think I covered most things. It's a very broad kind of perspective, also in linguistics. So you will see reflections of all of those pieces in the work that I'll talk about today. So today I will be talking primarily about individual home sign systems. So these are gesture systems used by deaf people who have not acquired an already existing language. So they do not have full access to a signing community. They cannot hear the spoken language that is used around them. They have not learned to read and write. Nevertheless, they create gesture systems that they use with the hearing people around them. And they use them as their primary language and, you know, in every context that they find themselves in, within their families, in their neighborhoods, in their towns. If they meet someone from outside, that is the system that they use. The home centers I'll be talking about today are socially integrated into their communities. So I would love to discuss the differences between the contexts in Bali and here. I think there are some important differences. It's not as seamless as my impression of deaf and hearing communication in contexts like village sign languages, where many people are familiar with the system. However, it's much better, shall we say, than it would be in a place like the United States, where very few people are comfortable using gestures when they meet a deaf person. So that is definitely an advantage in Nicaragua. And that's something I won't talk about so much today, but clearly home sign systems and Nicaraguan Sign Language are very strongly rooted in the gestures that are used by hearing people in Nicaragua. I will be showing some data from hearing people today. So again, I won't be able to review all of these results, but I will be talking about structures that have developed both in home sign systems, as well as comparing home sign systems with structures that are evolving and developing in Nicaraguan Sign Language. And I've included a few examples here, and you'll see a couple of examples soon. I want to start out by giving you some context. So I'll be showing you 3 examples, video examples. And again, I could talk about these examples just by themselves all day. I'm going to try to just show them to you, again, just to give you a flavor of what this kind of communication looks like. So I'll be showing you 3 different examples. And the first one is this one that is of 2 individual home signers. So when I say individual home signers, I mean that they are the only deaf person in their family. They don't interact regularly with other deaf people, whether they're home signers or signers of Nicaraguan Sign Language. So I'm not going to tell you now who are the home signers and which one is the hearing communication partner, but you'll probably figure it out by the end. I'll show you this example and then an example of a home signer with his mother, a clip that I extracted from a longer piece of his signing. And then third, I'll show you an example of what Nicaraguan Sign Language looked like about 20 years after its emergence. So it's not the very early stages, it's not super recent, but it gives you the flavor of the fluidity of that language in its recent past. Okay, so again, I'm going to show you this example. There's no subtitles or anything. It's just to give you a flavor of the kinds of turn taking and interactions that are possible, even among people who don't communicate regularly with each other. And I think this gives you an idea of how Nicaraguan Sign Language could have emerged so quickly in this kind of context. So now I'll turn to a clip of an adult home signer with his hearing mother. Okay, now I'm going to show it again with subtitles. And these are very enriched. This is not a gloss of his individual signs, but gives you a gist of what he was talking about. So again, I could talk about this clip all day. I will make 2 brief points. One is that, well, 3. This individual home signer signs very fluidly, right? He doesn't look like someone who is essentially the only person who really uses his system of gestures. Secondly, his mother, secondly, he knows about this event, even though he doesn't have full access to any kind of reporting about this event, right? Which is, I hope you all caught on. This is the attacks on September 11th in New York City. He was very concerned about me and Annie Senghas because he knew that we both lived in New York at the time. Thirdly, his mother thinks that he's talking about the Nicaraguan Civil War. So again, he's in his late 20s. They have lived together his whole life. This was very striking to me and prompted the third study that I will talk to you about today that shows that in the absence of context, the family members of these individual home signers really struggle to understand what they're talking about. And even in this conversation, there was quite a bit of context and she still didn't understand what he was talking about, even the general topic. So, okay, I will stop there. I want to give you a very brief schematic of the relationship between these individual home sign systems and the emergence of Nicaraguan Sign Language. So this has all taken place within the last 40 or so years, 40 to 50 years. And this very simplified version of this story is that prior to the late 1970s, there were no places where deaf people could gather and sign with each other. That began with the establishment and expansion of a school for deaf children in Managua. And every year after that, new children entered the school and learned the signing from the deaf students who were there before them. And so what we can see by comparing people who entered the community in different years is the evolution of the sign language. And it has become more grammatically complex over time. So the initial stages of that emergence were deaf people who had no previous exposure to language models, but had been using home sign systems with their families before they entered the school. So that is what we consider to be the beginning, the emergence of the linguistic community in Nicaragua. What I'm going to be talking about today is comparing the signing of deaf people who I'm calling these individual home signers who do not interact with each other, and the signing of deaf people who became part of this linguistic community, in fact, were the first members of this new linguistic community, and trying to understand what the effect of being part of a linguistic community where people are, I don't want to exactly say shared system because it's not fully shared. We do see important changes within that community, but relative to what individual home signers have, it is a more or less shared community. So again, I'm focusing on the individual home sign systems that I just highlighted on the left. And again, this comparison, especially between the individual home signers and that first cohort or group of signers who formed the deaf community, tells us about what role participating in a linguistic community plays in developing language structure. So now we come to a video. Again, this is now quite old, but it's sort of in the midpoint of the evolution of Nicaraguan Sign Language and gives you just a taste of what the signing looks like. So this slide, I'm not going to talk about these individual graphs, so don't worry if you cannot see them well, is just to summarize that we have done this kind of comparison in many contexts, looking at different aspects of language structure. And what we see is that home signers have a lot of linguistic structure that can be both more simple and more complex than what we see in the first cohort of Nicaraguan signers. And secondly, this is not described here, but we also see a lot of structures in these individual home sign systems that we do not see that are more complex than the signing produced by their communication partners. So I want to, again, just put into context some of the things that I'll be talking about. These individual home sign systems are created in the context of interactions with hearing communication partners. But it seems like for the kinds of linguistic structures that depend on conventionalizing within a group, that conventionalization is very slow when there is only one deaf person who uses the home sign as their primary language. And what I want to convince you of by the end of today is that this kind of communicative engagement, wanting to communicate with someone else, is necessary for that kind of structure to develop, but it does not provide the structure itself. So again, that's a conclusion that we come to by comparing the structures that home signers produce and their complexity with the structures produced by the hearing people around them over many, many years in a lot of cases. In the case of the people who were already adults when I began working with them. So again, a lot of this work, well, I think in this audience, there are not a lot of people who will challenge the assertion that home sign is a kind of emerging language. Although, I mean, that people have different ideas about that. So what I think, the way I characterize it, is that home sign systems have some, but not necessarily all, of the properties of established languages with very long histories. And so I've been trying to understand where these structures come from. Because again, importantly, home signers and the first cohort of Nicaraguan signers share a common characteristic where neither of them grows up with a language model. The difference with that first cohort of Nicaraguan signers is that they interact regularly with each other, and they're all trying, I don't think it's super intentional, they're trying to converge on a common language. Whereas that pressure seems to be a lot weaker in the context of one deaf person in a hearing family embedded in a hearing community. So I know it's taken me a long time to get to my questions. I will probably end up skipping some slides as we go along, but I want to tell you about 3 studies today. The first one is comparing home signers with Nicaraguan signers in how they name common objects. The second one is comparing home signers with their communication partners, looking at what I'm calling here specific objects. I'll explain why those objects are different. And then thirdly, I want to tell you about the study that shows that the communication isn't, that the hearing communication partners do not always understand the structures that are present in home sign. And these are very relatively simple structured sentences, just with 1 or 2 arguments in them. So 1 or 2 participants, potentially 3 if there's an inanimate object. Okay, so I'm going to start out by talking about the role of having a linguistic community in the conventionalization of lexical items. How people decide what they call things. Right, every language solves this problem in some way, but for most languages, that happened so long ago that we no longer have access to how that happened. But here we can see it, not quite in real time, but close. So I want to introduce this idea of the structure of a community. And I'm going to come back to this. This picture is here because we also have modeling results from an agent-based model. But that structure, that the picture is helpful to think about the structures of a home signing family with an individual home signer that's on the right. So the home signer is in the middle. And the way these interactions happen in Nicaragua, in these families, is that the home signer uses the home sign system with each of the hearing people in their family and their environment. But those hearing people don't use the home sign system with each other. Now, this may be different in other contexts, right? And I think that that's potentially an important difference between these kinds of family home sign systems and a village sign language or other kinds of family home sign systems, especially when there are multiple deaf people involved. So we can discuss how that might play out. But I want to contrast this structure where there's a central node and that goes out with the structure on the left, what I'm calling the Nicaraguan Sign Language type network, where in principle, every participant interacts with every other participant using the sign language. So you see that there are arrows between every pair of participants in that kind of network. So that's the main difference that we're highlighting here. So we asked people to look at very simple drawings of objects and ask them what they call it. And we measured the distance between 2 participants' responses for a given object using a vector. I can talk about the details of that. I'm already a little bit worried that I always spend too long setting the stage. So I will try to go a little bit more quickly. But I do want to show you the examples. So here is one individual home signer describing the cow. Okay. So what we found, and again, I'm just showing you a schematic of the timeline of how long each of these groups had to develop their systems. In both cases, for both the home signers had about 25 years of using their home sign system with their family members. And the timing of collecting the data in Nicaragua, again, we're comparing the home signers with the first cohort of Nicaraguan signers. So they also had about 25 years of using the language at the time these data were collected. So the number of years of using the language is comparable. What we find, so here on the x-axis, you can see the Nicaraguan signers on the left and the home sign systems on the right. And again, we're looking at each pair of home signers and their communication partners. So that's why there are 9 data points here. On the y-axis, we see a measure of conventionalization. So this is the weighted average distance between the responses that were produced by each pair. And lower mean closer to 0. So 0 means everybody produced exactly the same response. And higher means that there was more variability in their responses to these simple objects like cow. So what I think you can see clearly here is that the Nicaraguan signers are all producing responses that are very close to each other, whereas the home sign systems there's still quite a lot of variability in what people call, how people refer to these common objects, even after 25 years of using these family home sign systems. We also created an agent-based model, as I mentioned earlier, and this model also showed this contrast pretty clearly. So the average number of interactions was much higher for the home sign type networks, and those simulations did not always converge, in contrast to the Nicaraguan, the fully connected network. So our conclusion is that conventionalization of lexical items happens more quickly when people are richly connected, when there are more connections among the users of the system. So now I want to turn to how home signers and their communication partners conventionalize strategies to refer to specific types of objects. And here we're going to be talking about objects that you hold in your hand. So we know that there are typological patterns in how across sign languages, unrelated sign languages, home sign systems, and the gestures of hearing people who do not sign. And this has been referred to in the literature by Carol Patton and her colleagues as patterned iconicity. And what we have been engaged in is trying to understand the origins of these iconic handshake preferences. And I'll explain and give you examples now. This is work that I've done with Diane Brantari and Susan Golden Meadow and other colleagues over the last 20 years or so. Oh, let me just skip one. There we go. I wanted to highlight this work is the work of Maddie Kwam. She is a PhD student with me, and this is her first authored peer-reviewed publication. And I thank Wendy as Wendy Sandler is one of the co-editors of this special issue of the online journal Languages. And we are in the final stages of revising this work. And the title is Conventionalization. Sorry, I can't see the very top of my screen because of the Zoom thing. You can read the top. Conventionalization of iconic handshake preferences in family home sign systems. Okay, so I'll just go back quickly. Again, I'm not going to go through the details here for time, but we compared 9 home signing families that had either a child or an adult home signer. And we compared 2 hearing families. One was a family of people who were actually biologically related and, lived together. And the other group of hearing people were not related to each other. So we wanted to try to tease apart as many factors as possible. So this sort of daily interaction is one of those pieces that we wanted to, I don't want to manipulate, but to try to isolate in this quasi-experimental context. So here is not all of the items, but more than half of the items that we presented. And the contrast that we're primarily interested in is between handling and object hand shapes. So I think many of you who are familiar with sign languages already know this, but basically comes down to whether the sign shows how you hold an object, which is on the left, the way this is one adult home signer describing the mop, or one part of his description. So you can see that his hands are in a position that looks like he's holding it. Whereas on the right, you see an example of an object hand shape. And this is a case where his hand is representing the size and shape of the object itself and not how you hold it. So that's the contrast that we're interested in. And that previous work I referred to shows that sign languages seem to have a preference in the way they form the lexical items for these types of objects, that they seem to prefer handling or object. It's a slight preference, but it does show up. We also saw the third coding category was handling plus object. So this is a case where there's a mixture of both handling and object hand shapes in the response to a given item. So I want to share some of these findings with you. Home signers don't show a strong preference, but when there is a preference, it's a preference for handling. And you can see the ages of the child and adult home signers that we worked with, and the percentages that fell of their responses that fell into each of these categories: handling, object, or handling plus object. Okay, the second finding that emerged from this work, now we're looking at the patterns that we saw within families. So again, it's organized by the child or adult home signer, but now we're talking about the preference, the average preference within a family. So what we can see is that 4 families showed a handling preference, and the other 5 families did not show any clear preference for how the strategy that they used to talk about that object. And let me say here, again, this is not saying anything about the specific hand shape that was used. So there could still be quite a lot of variability, even among the responses where, for example, 78% of the family members had showed a preference for handling. They might still be using different hand shapes. Okay, this is a very coarse measure of their strategy. So that is a question for future work, is to investigate the specific hand shapes that they use. Because obviously that's also important when you are creating a lexical item. It kind of matters what the form of it is. Oh, I should have put this first. Sorry. That measure of conventionalization was a pairwise comparison. And again, I can say more about this. We did give partial credit if they were not exactly the same response. So what we see in this percentage of overall conventionalization, so regardless of whether participants were producing handling or object hand shapes, just how much they agreed with each other, we see that that percentage ranged from 48 to 71%. And here we do see an effect of how long the families have been interacting together. We see that the adult home signing families are more conventionalized than families where the home signer is a child or adolescent. To me, linguistically, one of the most interesting findings of this work is that adult home signers produced far more combined object plus handling forms. And these are interesting because these are likely to become grammaticalized into compound forms. So that again awaits further investigation. I'll just give you a quick video example of what that looks like. So here he's responding to the image of a rake. Okay, so you see the handling of the rake, the object of the rake, which is funny, right? Because no rake has this structure, but he's getting some influence from the handling part onto the object part. And then again, there's this little sandwich of the handling at the beginning and the end and the object in the middle. And it's very, very quickly produced. Okay, I'm now at the point that I asked Connie to ask me to stop so that we could have questions and discuss. I correctly predicted that I would run out of time. I will very briefly summarize. I'm not going to go through all the slides, but again, if you have questions about how we did this study, I will answer them. So, we were motivated to do this communication study, as I mentioned before, this comprehension study, because it really seemed like the hearing people were not always understanding what the home signer said, and sometimes in a really extreme way. And also because I noticed that even in less extreme ways, there was a lot of miscommunication when we were doing the studies. And so we thought we had these data about how well the family members were understanding the home signers that I did not analyze initially. These were part of my dissertation data that when we redid. So we basically took home signers productions that were descriptions of very simple events. Man push chair, woman drink, very, very simple events, and asked the communication partners to choose from a set of 4 pictures which picture matched. So let me show you an example of that, and then I'll show you the findings, and then I'll wrap up. Okay, so here's a schematic I should have been showing you. So for example, the home signer first saw an event like man push chair. He then signed the event. So you'll see in the bottom picture, the home signer is quite young here. That's because these were data collected almost 20 years ago now. And he is signing to his brother because we wanted to get the kind of communication that they produce on a regular basis. And at the time, the brother also had to pick a picture that he thought went with it. Now, at the time, we used that technique just to make sure we got full noun phrases, because that was the topic I was interested in for my dissertation. We were not looking specifically at how well the family members understood. We went back and did that later. So that's what you see at the top. We very carefully clipped out these productions and showed them to the mothers, and they had one chance to pick the right picture. And so those are the results that I'm going to show you now. So we compared the mother's performance on this task with the performance of signers of American Sign Language who were all deaf and early learners of ASL. And what we found is that in 3 of the 4 cases, the ASL signers who had never met the home signers and were not familiar with Nicaraguan culture or home sign at all performed significantly better in choosing the correct picture that went with the sentence that they saw. So we were really surprised by these findings. And I'm sure, I know this is a decontextualized task. You know, Connie and I have talked about this a lot. I'm talking to an audience interested in communication. Happy to talk more about these findings, but I think they are quite striking, and they do correspond with the experience, what I actually observe in day-to-day interactions with these families. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with just 2 additional slides. One, I want to tell you about the Equipo Sordo, which is the deaf team. And before we knew there would be a pandemic, Ann Sanghas and I decided that we wanted to have more participation from deaf people in Nicaragua in studying their own language. And it has turned out to be very good, because there are many political and pandemic related reasons that we cannot go to Nicaragua regularly right now. So this has turned out to be really great all the way around. So this is the Equipo Sordo in action, and an example of how we stay in touch with them via Zoom to help solve any problems that come up and plan the work. I also want to tell you about other work that I and my colleagues have been doing in Nicaragua and in other countries. I founded a nonprofit organization. The old name was Manos Unidas. The new name is Signs and Smiles. We previously focused just on Nicaragua, but now we are expanding our projects internationally to other countries. And one project that we're very proud of is a smartphone application called Signs and Smiles in Spanish that helps parents of deaf children in Nicaragua communicate with their children and give them a vocabulary foundation for language. It's not, well, I know this is not solving the problem of language deprivation, but it's a first step that is more widely available and cheaper to implement than other solutions. So I can talk more about my vision of what I hope that will become. I want to thank my collaborators and the sources of funding. And I have to show you this acknowledgement that NSF, the National Science Foundation, makes me show. And thank you so much for coming today. And I welcome your questions and comments and discussion.
Thanks. Thank you, Marie. Let's thank Marie, everyone, for your presentation. We really enjoyed it a lot. I think we have a little bit over 10 minutes for questions. I would like to coordinate the question answer discussion. Maybe people can raise their hands or post a note in the chat.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see people.
Yeah. Okay, so there's several people who raised their hands at the same time. So there's at least 3 questions. I would like to first give the floor to Ugur Khan.
I think Josefina was before me. Okay, I'm asking. Thank you for this great talk. I am just a master's student interested in home science, and I just read your paper, which published in 2017, and it's just comes to my mind that question. You say adult home signers use handling and object hand shape more, and I am just curious about that. What if language inside the house, home science systems develops over time, and the information in the video which recorded 20 years ago is not enough for mothers now? What if properties of language change over time? What if they become more structured over time? Because, why don't you ask home signers apply same task now and show these productions to their mothers? Thank you. That's my question.
Thank you for the question. So I think what you're asking is perhaps the home sign structure changed between the time we originally collected the data and later. Right. That is possible. I don't think the mothers will do better now because these sentences are very similar. And in fact, even when there's only one participant, even when the sentence has only 2 signs in it, the mothers do not get it 100% correct. I think that there is, and in fact, you didn't ask this, but I'm going to tell you, when we show these productions to the home signers themselves, they are also not 100%. And I think that there is something about not right, but the ASL signers were all native signers. They were all exposed to ASL from birth. So there are a lot of things that we could manipulate with the study to answer different, to address different hypotheses, different explanations. I think if we slowed down the productions, the home signers and the mothers would perform better. But I still think the mothers would not perform as well as you would expect, given that they have contributed to creating the system themselves. I do think that there is something related to biological maturation in both the perception of the signing and also the underlying structure of the grammar that is affected. And so we did show that the age of the person when they started learning the home sign system was associated with their comprehension. So the younger siblings, basically, the younger brothers and sisters perform better than the mothers, even though the mothers have had more time and were probably more influential in creating the system initially. But we did not rule out what you suggested, that they changed over time. I don't worry so much about that because their productions are very consistent already. We already show that they put the subject noun phrase first in the sentence. And I don't think there's a lot of room for them to develop more structure. And again, the sentences are very simple. So what you suggest is possible, but I think not likely. And thank you for reading the paper.
If I am not wrong, also mothers were not good at the comprehend spoken productions of their hearing children's, right? They
No,
are not.
they were quite good at that, but not 100%, but they were quite good.
100%.
Yeah. So we did that control to rule out that they were just not, they didn't understand what we were asking them to do.
Mhm. Thank you.
For reasons of time, unfortunately, I have to move on to the next question, and Josephina is up next.
Hi, Marie. Thanks so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I am interested in what you called our like complementary perspectives on home sign, because in the beginning you said that one conclusion you came to is that communicative engagement is a necessary ingredient for linguistic structure, but it's not the source of linguistic structure itself. And I guess what I'm interested in, or what Connie and I are interested in at the moment, is to look more closely at this communicative engagement itself and how it can, let's say, scaffold the emergence of linguistic structure. So what I was curious about is when you showed that clip of that one deaf home signer communicating with his hearing mother about the 9/11 attack, that he was talking about Osama bin Laden, and she thought that he was talking about the Nicaraguan civil war or something.
Yes.
So I'm really curious in what happens in this situation, because we didn't see that in the clip. How would the mother react? Would she communicate that there was a misunderstanding? Would he pick it up? Would he repair? Yeah, I would be really curious to know more about that.
Right. So in that particular, let me just give you a little bit more context for that clip. So we were waiting for my laptop to start up, before we did the real study, this very structured elicitation task. I have a lot of that kind of spontaneous interaction that I have not analyzed, because you well know how much labor and resources it takes and knowledge, right, of the context to annotate that properly. So that conversation went on for 40 minutes. Okay, because at some point my laptop was ready, but the conversation was so interesting. I was so fascinated that he understood so much about this event without really having direct access to it. And so he was talking, actually, again, I would have set up the camera differently if I had known that was going to happen, but he was primarily talking to my research assistant who was off camera. And so he went, it was not like I picked the one clip where his mom didn't understand or wasn't paying attention. He was talking about that for a really long time, about how he was worried about me and Annie because we were in New York, and she didn't get any of it. And in every group conversation we have ever had, she really doesn't follow. And so there's not, yes, I do have other situations, many situations where there are attempts to repair the communication, but I have not analyzed them in the way that you are doing now. And I think that seems like a very natural future collaboration, because I don't have the expertise in that kind of communication repair. I don't. So I would love to work with you to understand that better.
That's a pretty cool answer. So we do have time for hopefully slightly brief questions, one by Asle Uitzerek, and then I would like Wendy Sadler to ask the final question.
Yeah. Hi, Mary, welcome to Holland, and we would like to see you if possible. I didn't know that. Very nice to see you. I have a very brief question. So with these object labels, with manipulative object labels, me and Gerhard Ortega probably, but we've done a study with silent gestures. And we have found a lot of these compoundy things, but in a different way, where there is like an action. For example, for a pillow, they would silent gestures. They would do something like this, and then they would do like a size gesture. I think Josefina Safar also reported it, and then maybe Wendy Sandler also reported such maybe compound constructions, which can arise in the adult kind of silent gestures, like in one rendering. So it's not a result of conventionalization per se. So I was wondering if you had such cases in your data.
We generally, in that task, Maddie, my co-author, she did report how often participants responded with multiple gestures, and the hearing people were much less likely to do that. So again, for these particular stimuli, I have seen the kind of construction that you're talking about. I have seen that used by hearing gestures, including family members, often. So that is definitely a common strategy, but we didn't see it so much with these stimuli in this task.
Okay, interesting. Thank you very much. Well, I'll write you an email. Thank you.
Well, last but not least, Wendy, it's really good to see you here. You have the floor.
In Israel. I have to say that it's wonderful to see so many people that I know and like, and I really enjoyed your talk, Marie. There's so much there. My question is kind of technical, and I also wanted to make a short comment. I'll start with a comment. I think that your app for mothers is fantastic, because we always say, well, you know, hearing mothers should learn sign language, and they should be, the early communication with the child is so important cognitively, but we don't have any solution for that, really. So I would love to talk to you more about that. I think it's just wonderful. My question, a little question, is that you mentioned measuring the distance between labels. How did you do that? We make a distinction between two labels which are have the same sort of concept, but are signed differently, versus two different labels that are completely different. They're based on different concepts. So how did you measure the different distances?
Right, Wendy. So we had different measures for the different tasks because of the context. So in the first study that I reported, the conventionalization between pairs, we created a vector and basically noted whether, so let me back up. We call those strategies for how you iconically represent an object. We called them conceptual components. I forget now what you called them in your work, but we're talking about the same thing, right? What is the basis of the concept that the person is trying to invoke, right? So we called them conceptual components. And we basically put them in a vector, and then this was a way for us to handle these cases where people did produce multiple gestures, right? So that's how the work with Russell Ritchie proceeded. In the case where we were evaluating the conventionalization in Maddie Quam's paper, we, because we were interested in conventionalization within the family as a whole, we did these pairwise comparisons, and we basically, if they didn't overlap at all in their basically just handling or object, right? We didn't even care about the specific conceptual component. We just cared whether it was handling or object or a combination. So if they both produced a handling gesture, even if it was a different hand shape or a different concept, we gave them a 1.
I see. Okay.
If the two participants didn't overlap, they produced different iconic bases, we gave it a 0. And if there was partial overlap in the case where, for example, the adult home signer produced handling plus object and the mother produced handling, we gave them 0.5.
Okay, so you weren't.
And then we averaged those together to get the family conventionalization score.
Okay, I understand. You weren't interested in the actual phonology of the gesture so much.
I have been since the work with Russell Ritchie, but it doesn't make sense to talk about articulation and phonology if one person is doing this,
No.
the other person is doing this, right?
In
So
any case, it depends what your research.
again, that's a question for future work.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Connie, too.
And that's everyone. Let's thank Marie as well. I've asked everyone to put their videos.
Oh, that's so, I noticed that you were doing something, but I didn't see it in the chat. That is so nice. Will you take a screenshot?
Yes, I will do that.
That would be lovely.
Just waiting for everyone to put
Sure. And while everyone is coming on, I will make a comment in reply to Wendy's comment that we are very interested in Signs and Smiles in adapting that app for other sign languages. The code is already there. Obviously, we need to replace the videos and potentially alter, adjust the structure of the app to fit the particular cultural context. But we're very interested in supporting other deaf communities in using this tool. Again, I'll stop talking. I'm terrible at short comments, but contact me if you are interested in that.
Well, thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Marie. And thanks everyone for being present.
It's really